Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to discuss whether or not repositioning flights are worth it. In the world of travel, many of the times you're going to need to make yourself a connection flight. You may be flying out of a smaller airport, and to get yourself over to a major city that you're looking to travel to, you may need to reposition over to a larger airport with a connection flight, then to be able to travel from there over to that other major city. Or you may be loyal to a specific airline and have status or points or a travel credit with this airline, and for you to be able to use it, although the airline does fly to the destination that you're looking to travel to, they don't fly direct from your home airport. So you need to have a stop first before you're able to get over to this destination to be able to take advantage of using your credits or your points or your status benefits. And sometimes you may be traveling from one major city over to another major city, and there may end up being direct flights to be able to get over there, but it just ends up being a lot cheaper for you to end up doing a connection flight. In the world of points and miles, we talk about something called a repositioning flight. And for those of you who aren't familiar with this term, what this ends up meaning is that, say you end up seeing an award for a flight to go over to a destination that you desire to visit. But the award for this flight doesn't end up taking off from your home airport, but ends up taking off from a different airport that you would have to reposition to be able to take that award flight. An example would be, say you happen to live in Las Vegas and you wish to travel over to Tokyo. And when you're looking for an award flight, you end up realizing that there's award space open to fly out of San Francisco in ANA's first class over to Tokyo. So what you'd end up doing is you'd end up booking yourself a cheap flight from Las Vegas over to San Fran, and then take that first class flight over to Tokyo. It's pretty easy to understand, and in many cases, this ends up being the best way to get yourself luxury flights for incredibly cheap. But if you can avoid that connection flight for a lesser experience, which one is wiser to do? In 2024, I've had a number of different repositioning and connection flights. Some of them went incredibly smooth, others have been horrible disasters. My smoothest one was when I booked a first class flight on ANA from Tokyo over to San Fran. Now, I live in Los Angeles, so what I had to do was book myself this award flight to get over to San Fran, and end up booking myself a cheap flight from San Fran over to Los Angeles. I absolutely loved my first class experience. It was the cherry on top to my already incredible trip over to Tokyo. And then when I landed in San Fran, I relaxed in the Centurion Lounge for I believe about 2 hours, where I had myself some Prosecco, which wasn't as good as the Krug champagne that I had in ANA's first class, but it sufficed for the couple hours that I was waiting. I called on my family to let them know that I was back in the country, and then time flew by really quickly because Alaskan Airlines was already ready for me to board onto their plane to be able to fly over to Los Angeles. Now, this first class award flight that I booked was an absolutely sweet deal. I only had to transfer under 60,000 points because it was during a transfer bonus to be able to book this first class flight, plus pay roughly about $200 in taxes and fees. I was extremely comfortable the entire time. There was absolutely no delays. I would 1000% redo this entire trip if I end up having the chance, because it ended up being an incredible experience. Now, I want to compare that flight to another flight that I booked that had a connection when I was flying from Los Angeles over to Boston. Now, the way I ended up booking this one, it wasn't an award flight. I had a flight credit, which I believe was from my Venture X card. But anyways, for my flight to Massachusetts, where I grew up, I booked this as a red-eye, which is normally what I do if I end up not booking myself a lay flat bed. Some people book the lay flat bed specifically for if they can get the red-eyes so they can sleep the entire time. But if I end up booking myself a business class flight, I usually like it to be during the day so I can end up enjoying the food that they're offering, the drinks, being able to see a newer movie on a larger screen and not on a size that feels like I'm watching an entire movie on an iPhone. And if I want to go to sleep on a lay flat bed, I have that as an option during the day. So when I went to book this flight, I saw that I had two different options that interest me. The first one was a red-eye direct flight from Los Angeles over to Boston, and it was the cheapest direct flight that was an option. And then the second one was a red-eye flight, but it went from Los Angeles over to New York. You had to stop in New York for a couple hour layover and then go from New York over to Boston. The direct flight was somewhere between about $60 to $70 as a difference. Now, normally I would just pay this and do the direct flight, but I had a flight credit that I wanted to use, and with this flight credit, the flight that had the layover was very close to the exact cost of the flight credit. So I thought to myself, not only could I just completely wipe out this entire flight credit, but I also could check out the new Sapphire Lounge that's at JFK, which I haven't experienced before. So it'd be nice to be able to check out that lounge, eat myself some breakfast, and then take off over to Boston after a couple hours there. One note that I didn't add is that typically when I end up taking the red-eye flight over to Boston, I usually have to wait about an hour for this shuttle called the Logan Express to pick me up so I can end up taking it over to my hometown. Because the shuttle doesn't typically start picking up passengers from Logan when I land, so I usually have to wait about an hour before they actually start doing the pickup cycle. So I would have had to wait an hour either way, So why not check out the lounge at JFK, get myself some free food before I go over to Massachusetts. So unfortunately, not everything went as smooth as I just described it. In fact, it went terribly bad. So originally when I arrived over to JFK, I thought to myself that I could just be able to easily access the Sapphire Lounge, but what I didn't realize was that the Sapphire Lounge is not connected to where JetBlue's terminal is. So for me to be able to get over to the Sapphire Lounge, I'd have to leave security, go over to the other terminal, go back through security, and then walk a distance to be able to get myself over to the Sapphire Lounge. And then when I was ready to board the plane again, I'd have to leave security again, go over to where JetBlue's terminal is, go back through security, and then walk over to my gate to be able to board the plane. Talk about a pain in the butt. So I decided to go over to the Sapphire Lounge, and it is a decent lounge, but it's definitely not worth the hassle to go through all of this and the entire security process just to be able to access that lounge. But after I left the Sapphire Lounge and then left security and then went back through security and went over to my gate, I saw that my flight was delayed like a little over an hour. And instead of me being able to just go back to the lounge, I didn't want to have to go through that entire process all over again, so I just waited by the gate. And then eventually we got onto the plane, and then while we were on the plane, we sat there for 3 hours for some ridiculous reason that wasn't clearly explained to us. Eventually they took us back over to the tunnel, we were able to get off the plane, but then the crew timed out, so we had to wait for an entire new crew to be able to come before we were able to take off to go over to Boston. It took over 10 hours from when we originally were supposed to take off to actually take off from JFK Airport. If I just paid the additional $70, I wouldn't have had to went through this entire circus of an experience. JetBlue first tried to claim it was weather, but then they said it was a mixture of weather and then some issues that they were dealing with, so they ended up giving me another JetBlue flight credit that I'm gonna have to use at some point in the next year. So in 2024, I've had my smoothest flight connection experience, but also my worst flight connection experience. So I know how well it can go, but I also know how horrible of an experience it can end up being. Now I'm gonna get back to talking about repositioning flights. So there's a few things that you need to take in consideration when you are booking a repositioning flight. The first thing is going to be the cost of the repositioning flight. This is going to be an additional cost as compared to what you are paying for that award flight. This can end up being possibly $100 or a couple $100 or additional miles to be able to book this flight. Next thing you need to factor in is travel time. So if you're doing this to save money, what you need to do is calculate how much money you're saving as compared to how much time you're adding on. So for example, my flight over to Boston, I was flying over to New York, staying there for an additional 2 hours to save myself $70. So in this example, without including the fact that I wanted to visit the lounge and also I would have had to wait in Boston anyways, I'm valuing my time for this trip at $35 an hour. The reason why I bring up time and feel that it is a big factor is because I know of people who booked themselves repositioning flights, got themselves a hotel in that city for the night just so they can end up getting themselves either a business or first class flight out in the morning, as compared to flying just in economy the entire way from the destination that they originally started from. So flying to a new city, staying there for 12 hours and paying for a night at a hotel in that new city as compared to flying directly out of your original city and only taking 8 hours to get there. Now this shorter flight is an economy flight as compared to this longer taking flight ends up being a business or first class flight. Now everyone has different type of levels of what they can take for discomfort on a plane. If you are a taller person or a wider person, it might end up being really difficult to be on a plane for 8 hours in economy. This could cause a ton of pain for the entire trip, and then when you end up getting off the plane, you could still be in pain for a few hours or maybe even a couple of days because of how uncomfortable you were for those 8 hours. And then there's other people who can withstand it better or are smaller, and although that they would prefer to fly in first or business class, if they flew in economy, it really wouldn't end up being that bad, even if it's 8 or more hours. If you are a taller or wider person, like say you were 6'4", I think I can understand why you'd want to go get yourself a hotel. If I was 6'4", I may end up getting myself a hotel too, but if you are a smaller person, I don't know if it ends up being worth the hassle. For me, time in the destination is more important than the flight experience. I know a lot of us may end up disagreeing with that when it comes to the points and miles world, but that's just how I feel. Although I wish to take a nice flight there, I'm taking this flight because I want to go to that destination. So if you're more than doubling my travel time, essentially taking away from me exploring this destination, I'm not gonna go through that trouble. And I'm not saying this to be judgmental at all. I've done a number of repositioning flights just this year, but what I try to do with them is I try to be rational when it comes to my repositioning flights. The first thing I always wanna ask myself is, how much additional time am I adding to this trip? The flight over with JetBlue ended up being a disaster, but usually the flights aren't delayed that much, so I was only going to be adding a couple of hours when it came to my flight over to Boston. And for most of my repositioning flights that I do, I usually book them so that when I end up arriving at that repositioning airport, I'm only there for like 2 to 3 hours. Now I'll admit, there's definitely been a number of times where I have been nervous where there have been slight delays with the flight that is my repositioning flight, and I wonder what's going to end up happening if I end up missing my main flight across the ocean. I have read about people who book themselves multiple repositioning flights just in case, say, American Airlines ends up getting delayed, but they still have another repositioning flight on United, and they can just cancel the American Airlines flight since they have free cancellations when it comes to award bookings, and then be able to just fly over there with United on time. For myself, I haven't went through that type of trouble, and so far, it hasn't bit me in the butt, but maybe at some point it might. Also, what's highly important to me when I am doing a repositioning flight is that there ends up being a lounge at that airport. I don't really mind if I am in the lounge for 3 hours, if I can get myself some drinks, some food, watch some TV, or just do some work on my computer. But if I end up seeing a repositioning flight that's within America to an airport that only has a bunch of full priority pass lounges, well, this is gonna end up being an issue for me. Now, sometimes you can't resolve the fact that there's just gonna end up being a lot of time in between your repositioning flight landing and then also your other flight taking off. So what I've decided to do with this, when I've noticed that there is an extended amount of time in between these two flights, is that if I end up going to a destination that I have not visited before, well, I just make that now a part of the trip. One example that I've done for this is that I booked a flight to fly over to Stockholm, Sweden, and when booking this flight, I saw that the availability was going out of Mexico City. So I knew that I was gonna have to go over to Mexico City to be able to get myself this really cheap award flight. Now, I've never been to Mexico City, so I started to ask myself the question, do I wanna pay a few $100s to fly over to Mexico City, wait at the airport for 8 hours, and then take off on KLM Flying Blues business class over to Amsterdam, wait there for another couple hours, and then go from Amsterdam over to Stockholm, Sweden? What I decided to do instead was that I looked at what type of things I could end up doing in Mexico City, and I realized that the time I'm actually gonna be flying out of Mexico City is gonna be the day after Mexican Independence Day. So what I instead did was I booked the flight over to Mexico City to land a few days before so I can end up exploring Mexico City, have a cool time when it's during their Mexican Independence Day, and then take off over to Stockholm, Sweden. So I'm not just going to Mexico City to wait at the airport for 9 to 10 hours. I get to go over there and explore the city and make it part of my trip. Now, I'm a solo traveler and I have some flexibility when it comes to how I end up booking travel. I imagine that if you were traveling as a couple or if you're traveling as a large family, you're gonna end up having a different answer for how you end up liking to go about repositioning flights. I imagine that more couples probably wouldn't mind staying at a hotel one night before taking off on the business class flight. And also I would imagine that people who end up traveling with larger families, I'm talking about 4 or more, probably don't want to end up having multiple different connection flights because especially if you have younger kids, I imagine it probably ends up being a process every single time you need to go into a new airport, onto a new plane, exiting off that plane, and then grabbing your stuff. But also I imagine that repositioning flights for families is probably super important because it can end up saving you a lot of money for one person. So if you need to do this for 4 or 5 people, this can end up being a massive savings to the point where you may not even be able to take the trip if you don't end up doing this repositioning flight just because of how much of a savings ends up being as compared to if you just decide to do a direct flight, which can end up being either a lot when it comes to a cash fare or a lot when it comes to how many points are required for 4 or more people. 1,000,000 points for a solo traveler can get you a long way. 1,000,000 points for a family of 5, depending on how advanced you are when it comes to finding award availability, you'd probably be lucky to get yourself one international trip throughout the year. Now, I really don't know what is the right or wrong answer when it comes to repositioning flights. I know some people who just do not want to have to deal with the hassle of repositioning flights at all. They'll fly economy to wherever they need to go as compared to stopping somewhere for a business class flight. And I know other people who don't mind repositioning to a destination, waiting in that lounge for the entire day, and then taking off in first class across the ocean. I will admit that I always feel kind of weird when I end up backtracking to do a repositioning flight. Like say I end up finding a repositioning flight to fly over to Korea, but I need to go from Los Angeles over to Vegas, over to Korea. It is kind of weird that I'm going backwards about 45 minutes in flight, then to go over to Korea, which I don't really mind, but if I end up having to do something like go from Los Angeles over to Dallas, then to fly from Dallas over to Hawaii, just to fly on Hawaiian Airlines business class, that to me I feel like would end up being a little bit extreme. But hey, if it works for you and it gets you enough savings and the price of that destination you travel to is that great, then I guess it can make sense. But hopefully you enjoyed this video. Let me know in the comment section down below, what are your thoughts about repositioning flights? How much time are you willing to do with this repositioning flight to go over to this destination? Does it matter about time? Does it matter about money or savings and points? What are your thoughts when it comes to repositioning flights? Now, if you happen to have any questions about repositioning flights, you can drop that in the comment section down below and I'll do the best I can to answer it. If you happen to be interested in any credit cards, check out my referral links in the description box down below to learn more. If you do decide to use any of my links, it does really help out the channel and I'll be incredibly thankful for your support. And if you happen to really like this video, do me a favor, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, share this video, and have a beautiful rest of your day.